Okay, so tonight's class we're going to visit some of the popular passages that Christian missionaries marshal to prove their contentions. We've seen in previous classes that missionaries make fairly bold claims about what they are able to find in the Bible. It's very common for missionaries to claim that the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, has hundreds of passages which they claim prove their contention that Jesus was the Messiah, and they also find passages in the Jewish Bible which, again, they maintain prove many elements of their theology. So we've covered many of the popular ones in previous classes. Tonight we're going to cover three fairly popular passages, what Christians refer to as proof texts. Again, they claim these are texts that prove their beliefs. And I wanted to begin tonight by sharing with you a passage from the wisest man who ever lived, King Solomon, who wrote in the book of Proverbs, chapter 18, verse 17, "The one who first states their case seems right, until the other comes and cross-examines." What Solomon is basically saying is that when someone presents their brief, when they present their argument for what they believe, it can often sound very compelling. And we find that in many areas of life. If you go to a courtroom, you could sit through a trial where the prosecution presents their case against someone, and it sounds like the person is really guilty. And everyone might feel that this is the end of the case. They've made a very, very strong presentation. But then there's another side to the story. There's the defense attorney. And they're able to often completely rebut and destroy the case of the prosecution. So Solomon is saying that we shouldn't automatically take an argument as it's presented without really having a chance to cross-examine, to question the assumptions of the argument. We find that, for example, today, many Jewish university students find themselves very frustrated when they're on campus and representatives of the Palestinian cause are able to present their propaganda in a way which sounds very compelling, and Jewish students often begin questioning and doubting, maybe we don't have a right to live in the land of Israel, maybe we should give 100% of the land back. And so when people make their case, they present their argument, we have to always bear in mind there's another side to the story. And Solomon is telling us here that that cross-examination is critical. So tonight we're going to look at three very popular passages that are marshaled by Christian missionaries, and we'll have a chance to cross-examine them. So the first passage is from the book of Micah. Many Christians pronounce it as Micah. And the critical verse is in chapter 5, verse 1, although in a Christian Bible it's going to be chapter 5, verse 2. As I've mentioned previously, sometimes the pagintation between the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures might be off a verse occasionally. So we have in front of us the Jewish pagintation, and the verse reads as follows: "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days." Very popular passage among Christian missionaries, and they basically try to argue two things. They try to show that this passage demonstrates two things. Number one, they make the claim that from this passage we see that the Messiah, the one who will rule in Israel, will be born in Bethlehem. That's the first claim that Christian missionaries make, that this passage is teaching us that the Messiah is someone who will be born in Bethlehem. They say, ... Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and therefore this becomes another piece of evidence that they advance. Obviously, this by itself wouldn't prove anything. No one's going to say that just because someone's born in Bethlehem, it would prove they're the Messiah, because obviously there have been numerous people born in Bethlehem. But Christians will assert that there are many pieces of evidence, and when you take them all together, the case is very, very strong. So the first piece that they are claiming is that in this passage, we learn that the Messiah will be someone born in the city of Bethlehem. And the second thing that many Christians claim is that from this passage, and again, it's based upon the way they translate it, based upon this passage, they say you can see the Messiah will be divine. The Messiah will be God. Why is that? Because they translate the phrase Mikedem Mimei Olam, which is rendered here from old, from ancient days, they will translate as from everlasting or from eternity. So what they're saying is that this ruler who will come from Bethlehem will be someone whose origins go back from eternity, meaning that this person really has existed forever. Who has existed forever other than God himself? Those are the two concepts, the two ideas that Christian missionaries try to extract from this passage in Micah. So let's go back now and try to understand the passage. The prophet starts off by saying, "But you, Bethlehem of Ephrat." Now, we know in our Tanakh, in our scriptures, that there was another city of Bethlehem, Beit Lechem, really, in Hebrew, Beit Lechem, house of bread, right? Beit Lechem, house of bread. There was another city of Beit Lechem in the territory of Zevulun, the territory of the tribe Zevulun. We know that from the book of Joshua, chapter 19, verse 15. So our passage here in Micah differentiates this city, Bethlehem, from the one in Zvulun, and it makes it clear that it's talking about the Beit Lechem, which is in the Ephrat area of the territory of Judah. We know there was a big tribe called Judah, and an area in the tribe of Judah was called Ephrat. You can go there in Israel today. And Beit Lechem, we're told, is in that area of Ephrat. So the prophet here is saying, "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrat, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you will come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, from whose origin is from old, from ancient days." What is significant about this city, Beit Lechem, is that we know from the Bible that Beit Lechem was the birthplace of King David. We see that in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 12. This was the place where David himself came from. And so there are basically two classical ways in which this passage in Micah is understood. The first way it's understood is that the prophet Micah is addressing not a city. You wouldn't normally speak to a city, but he's addressing that family, that famous family who comes out of Beit Lechem, which is the family of David. So the prophet Micah here is addressing the house of David. That's who the subject is. It's the house of David, the family of David. And what is the prophet Micah saying? He's saying that even though this family could be seen as the least distinguished family among the families of Judah, right? The way the prophet words it here in this English translation is one of the little clans of Judah, or one of the least of the clans of Judah. It's a very, very fuzzy word. But the way it's understood here is that it's not the most distinguished of the families of Judah. So the Micah is saying to the house of David, even though your family could be seen as one of the least distinguished families from the tribe of Judah, nevertheless, it's from your family that the Messianic king will emerge. According to this reading again, Micah is not saying that the Messiah would be born in Beit Lechem, but the Messiah would come from King David, who comes from Beit Lechem. Again, it's important to understand. Micah here is not saying the Messiah himself would be born in the city of Beit Lechem, but the Messiah will descend from King David, who is from Beit Lechem. Now, what would be the problem with David's family that would lead us to perhaps assume that they were from the least distinguished families in the tribe of Judah? What was there about David's family that might seem problematic? So the answer to that question is we have to go back to the roots of King David. We know from the Bible that David descends from a very, very famous woman whose name was Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite. And in the story of Ruth, what happens is her husband dies, and Ruth desires to return to the land of Israel, to leave her homeland of Moab, and to go back with her mother-in-law, Naomi, to live in Israel. Ultimately, Ruth meets a man there called Boaz, and Boaz marries Ruth, and the book of Ruth tells us that this woman, Ruth, who converted to Judaism and married Boaz, was an ancestress, a progenitor of, ultimately, King David. The problem, however, is, in our Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verses 3 to 4, we're told that it's not so simple for a Moabite to convert to Judaism. As a matter of fact, what the Torah tells us is that a Moabite is prohibited, is not allowed to convert to Judaism. And the Bible gives the reason. The Bible says that the Jews had been wandering in the desert after they left Egypt, and they came to the territory of the country of Moab, and the Moabites did not come out to greet the Jewish people with bread and with water. They were very, very cruel. And here these people are traveling in the desert. The Moabites, the Bible says, should have been forthcoming and bringing the Jewish people water and bread. They refused to do that. So because of that cruelty, the Bible says that a Moabite can never enter the congregation of the Jewish people, is never allowed to convert to Judaism. So we have a big problem here. At least Christians have a big problem. Because if the Bible tells us that a Moabite can never enter into the congregation of Israel, so how does Ruth join the Jewish people in a way so that her grandchild, David, can be considered a legitimate Jewish person and to be the Jewish king, the progenitor of the Messiah? How does that line of David ever really have any legitimacy where it goes all the way back to an illicit relationship? A Moabite like Ruth should not have been allowed to enter into the Jewish people. And Christians have really no adequate way of dealing with this. They basically have this verse in the book of Deuteronomy, which seems to literally block the ability of Ruth to join the Jewish people, and therefore there doesn't seem to be any way of granting David any legitimacy as a Jewish king. That would destroy basically the entire Davidic line. Judaism, however, as we learned several weeks ago, is not based simply upon the written text of the Bible. Judaism asserts that God gave an oral Torah as well, oral teachings. And our oral tradition teaches us that the prohibition against entering the Jewish people only applied to males from the Moabite family. It only applied to males. Why? Because the Bible said, because they didn't come out to greet you with bread and water. Only the males would have been expected to come out and greet the Jewish people with bread and water. Females would not have been expected to do that. And so therefore we're taught that females were never prohibited from entering among the Jewish people. When the text of the Bible says a Moabite, a male Moabite, a Moavi, cannot enter the congregation of Israel, the rabbis teach, yes, a Moavi can't, but a Moaviyah, a female Moabite, is allowed to. Nevertheless, David's line has this controversial or this seemingly problematic family. Anyone that looks at it is going to say, okay, even though she's allowed to convert, but she comes from a people who were not really allowed to convert. And these people were a big problem for the Jewish people. And there seems to be something you could say unseemly or inappropriate about the lineage of King David. So that's why Micah here says that the line of David is a family that could have been considered from the least dignified among the Jewish people. Nevertheless, we're told they will be the progenitors of the Messiah. Now, another reading of Micah another possible way, I mentioned there are two possible ways of reading this, is that the prophet Micah is addressing not the family of King David, but he could be seen here as addressing the city, the town of Bethlehem in Ephrat. He might have been addressing this town, saying that even though this town was one of the smallest towns in the area, in the territory of Judah, it wasn't the biggest city, it wasn't the most significant city, it was a pretty backwater, small little city without much of a reputation to it. Nonetheless, from this city would descend someone who would become the king of Israel and the progenitor of the Messiah, and that would be David himself. So again, the passage here, according to this secondary reading, would be that the prophet Micah is telling us that the Messiah would descend from a child of the city of Bethlehem, from Ephrat, which is King David himself. The passage here in Micah is not teaching us that the Messiah himself is born in the city of Bethlehem. It's telling us that the Messiah will descend from someone who comes from this town. Now what's interesting is that this proof text, this passage in Micah, is unusual as a proof text that's used by Christian missionaries because it's one of the few Christian missionary proof texts that's actually speaking about the Messiah. We've seen previously that the vast majority of proof texts that Christians point to, claiming that they're messianic proof texts, are not even passages that are speaking about the Messiah. This passage in Micah, interestingly, happens to be speaking about the Messiah. However, if we look carefully at this passage in Micah, it mentions several things about this Messiah that clearly were not fulfilled by Jesus. So, for example, in verse number 1, it speaks about this descendant, this person who will be coming out of the city of Bethlehem Ephrata, who will be descendant of David, who come from that city. He'll be a ruler. He will rule in Israel. Jesus never ruled. He was never a ruler. He never ruled. So it's difficult or impossible to say Jesus fulfilled what's in this passage. In verse 2, it speaks about at this time when this ruler will come to the land of Israel, when this ruler will reign, it says that there'll be a reuniting of the kingdom of Judah with their lost brothers from the 10 lost tribes from the kingdom of Israel. So again, if you read in verse 2, it speaks about the rest of his kindred will return to the people of Israel. There's going to be a reuniting, and we've seen this before in the messianic prophecies that Jews believe are messianic prophecies. We believe that one of the things that will happen is there'll be a reuniting of all the Jewish tribes, and that's what it says here in Micah verse 2, chapter 5, verse 2. But again, that never happened in the time of Jesus. And finally, in verse 4, it speaks about everlasting universal peace that will take place during the reign of this ruler. And again, Jesus did not rule, he did not reunite the Jewish people, and he certainly did not live at a time when there was universal peace. The second thing that I mentioned before that Christians try to extract from this passage is the idea that the Messiah will be someone whose roots are everlasting from eternity. That's the way they translate this phrase, Mikeda Mimei Olam. Meaning that this person that we're talking about here in this passage, he goes back eternally. We're going to see, however, that if you look up this expression throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, it never means eternally. So let's go through the second part of this first page here, a number of places where the Bible speaks about Mimei Kedem, Mimei Olam, Mikedem, Mimei Olam. There are different variations, I'll spell them out for you, that the Bible uses this expression. In Isaiah chapter 23, verse 7, "Is this your joyous city, whose antiquity is of ancient days, Mimei Kedem?" No one's going to assume the city in this verse exists from before time even started. I mean, no one's going to assume this city being spoken of goes back eternally, forever, everlasting in time. In Malachi chapter 3, verse 4, "Then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto the Lord, as in the days of old, as in former days. Kimei olam. Again, the same expression that Micah uses. No one is going to assume that the sacrifices that were brought by the Jewish people were brought eternally back in the past. They obviously started at a certain point in Jewish history. They're not beyond time. They don't go back eternally. In the book of Micah, chapter 7, verse 14, feed your people with your rod, the flock of your heritage, which dwells solitarily in the wood in the midst of Carmel. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead as in the days of old, Kimei olam. Again, the same expression, essentially, not speaking about anything that goes back eternally to times everlasting. In Jeremiah chapter 46, verse 26, and I will deliver them into the hand of those that seek their lives, and into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and into the hand of his servants, and afterward it will be inhabited as in the days of old, says the Lord, Kimei kedem. Again, no one's going to assume that the passage here is referring to something that was inhabited before time even started. In the book of Amos, chapter 9, verse 11, in that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen, and I will close up the breaches of it, and I will raise up his ruins, and I will build it as in the days of old, Kimei olam, again referring to the earlier temples, which don't go back infinitely in time. The book of Micah, chapter 7, verse 20, you will perform the truth to Jacob, the mercy to Abraham, which you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old, Mimei kedem. Again, our ancestors did not live eternally in the past. We know when they came about. Isaiah chapter 51, verses 9 to 10. Awake, awake, put on your strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the ancient days. Kimei kedem. In the generations of old. Are you not in that has cut Rahab and wounded the dragon? Are you not of which has dried the sea, the waters of the great depths of the sea, a way for the ransom to pass over? Again, no one would read this passage assuming that it's speaking about times that go back eternally. In Lamentations chapter 1, verse 7, Jerusalem recalled the days of her suffering and sorrow, all the treasures that were hers in the days of old, Mimei kedem. Again, something that takes place within history, not beyond history. In Isaiah chapter 63, verses 9 and 11, it speaks about God rescuing the Jews as in days of old. Again, Mimei kedem. Mimei olam, the same exact expression as in Micah chapter 5. We've covered just about every time this phrase appears in the Bible. Now, what does it mean in Micah when it says that the origins of this line, the origins of this ruler, will be from old, from ancient days? That's what Micah says to us, that the origins of this ruler will go back from days of old, from ancient days. What it's saying is one of two things. Either it's telling us that when the Messiah comes, he will be someone that comes from a very ancient line. He's coming from the line of David. David is already living hundreds of years before these prophecies in Micah are stated. And could be that the Messiah comes many years after Micah. So from the time the Messiah shows up, it's going to be already a long time after King David. Or you could even say the Messianic line goes back even before David to Judah. The Bible tells us that of the 12 sons of Jacob, the king is going to come from the line of Judah. So the line of the Messiah is going back very, very far. Alternatively, you could say that the idea of the Messiah is an ancient idea. The rabbis in the Talmud tell us that even before God created the world, he had the concept of the Messiah already in mind. But the passage here is not telling us that the Messiah himself will be someone who goes back in time eternally. Micah clarifies, by the way, if you look at the passage in Micah carefully, he clarifies that this Messiah will not be divine, because in verse 3, Micah tells us he distinguishes between the Messiah and between God. So if you look carefully at verse 3, it speaks about this ruler, and it says, he will stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord. This ruler is going to have strength given to him by God. Not that this ruler will be God, but he will operate with the strength of God in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. The Lord is God. So we're told here that this ruler, this Messiah, he is someone that relates to God as his God. It's not telling us here that this Messiah is God, right? God is his God. So verse 3 very clearly distinguishes between this Messiah and between God himself. And there's one more piece I'd like to share with you. The Christian reading is that Micah is teaching us here that the Messiah has to come from Bethlehem, and Christians assert that Jesus was from Bethlehem. The question is that 100% clear? Is it 100% clear that Jesus really was from the city of Bethlehem? So, if you look on the next page, we have the infancy narrative of Jesus from Matthew chapter 2, and it begins by telling us in verse 1, Jesus was born in Bethlehem in the area of Judea. That makes it pretty clear. And Matthew goes on to explain what happens to the baby Jesus. So Matthew explains that after Herod, King Herod, heard that this baby Jesus was born and that this baby is going to be the Messiah, Herod had very evil intentions. So in verse 12 on the left-hand side of the page, Joseph, the father of Jesus, he was warned in a dream. That the three magi were warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, so they returned home another way. After the magi, had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said to Joseph, "Rise up and take the child and his mother and escape with them to Egypt and stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to do away with him." Herod, who's just found out that Jesus, this little baby, is born in Bethlehem, Herod is going to come to try and kill Jesus. So Joseph and Mary are told basically get out of town, flee to Egypt, and stay there until the danger passes. And then we're told in verse 19 that the time came when Herod died, King Herod died. So an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream in Egypt and said to him, "Okay, now that Herod is dead, rise up, take the child and his mother, and go with them to the land of Israel, for the men who threatened the child's life are dead." So he rose and took the mother and child with him and came to the land of Israel. Now, where do we assume they were heading when they went back to Israel? They had come from Bethlehem, so we would assume they were heading back to Bethlehem. However, hearing that Archelaus had succeeded his father Herod as king of Judea, and that's where Bethlehem was, in the area of Judea, so they were afraid to go there. And being warned by a dream, they withdrew to the region of the Galilee. They went north to the Galilee. And there they settled in a town called Nazareth. Why did they settle in Nazareth? Ostensibly, we're told they could have gone to any city in the Galilee, right? Go to Tzfat, go to Tiberias. Why did they go to Nazareth? So Matthew says they went to the city of Nazareth to fulfill the words spoken through the prophets, "He shall be called a Nazarene." Ostensibly, Matthew claims there was a prophecy that he, the Messiah, will be called a Nazarene, meaning someone from the city of Nazareth, and that's why they had to move to Nazareth. Obviously, it's an absurd notion that you move to a city to fulfill a prophecy. That's a fairly easy prophecy to fulfill if you can just get up and do it. We already learned in this course that there is no such prophecy in the Jewish Bible. The Jewish Bible never tells us the Messiah will be called a Nazarene. But that's the story in Matthew. Again, in Matthew, Jesus is born in Bethlehem. That's where he's from. Why does he go to Nazareth? Because he couldn't go back to Bethlehem. It was dangerous. So they basically go to another area in the land of Israel. They go north to the Galilee. They choose Nazareth to fulfill a prophecy. Keep those facts in your head. Now on the next page, we go to the story of the infancy narratives in the book of Luke. And here we'll see something astounding, incredible. In Luke chapter 2, we're told the following. In those days, a decree was issued by the Emperor Augustus for a registration to be made throughout the Roman world. There was going to be a census taken of the entire Roman Empire. This was the first census of its kind, and it took place when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. For this purpose, everyone made his way back to his own town, to his hometown. So Joseph went up to Judea from the town of Nazareth in the Galilee to register at the city of David called Bethlehem, because he himself, Joseph, was of the house of David by descent. What Luke is telling us is that Joseph and Mary were not residents of Bethlehem. They were residents of Nazareth. They were living in Nazareth. Why did they go to Bethlehem? Not because they had been living there. It's because Luke claims there was a census being taken, and Joseph's family originated in Bethlehem, so he has to go back to Bethlehem. Now, when you think about this, it's very peculiar. It's actually absurd. Because if a government is conducting a census, they want to know how many people are living in each city of their domain. They want to know how many people are living in Jerusalem, how many are living in Tel Aviv, how many are living in Bethlehem, how many are living in Nazareth. Can you imagine taking a census and every person has to travel back to their original city? First of all, the land of Israel would look like a disaster area. People running around, going here, going there. No one's going to stay put. What would be the purpose of having people go back to their original hometown where they first came from? Usually you want to count people so you know how to tax them. And you tax people where they live, not where they were first from. That's one problem here. There are many other problems. We don't have time to pick this story apart. But the important thing is that in Matthew, Joseph and Mary are basically living in Bethlehem. That's their town. And they only end up in Nazareth because they're forced to flee somewhere else. But in Luke's story, Joseph and Mary are citizens. They live in Nazareth. That's their town. And they only end up in Bethlehem because of this census. Now, she was expecting a child, we're told. Mary was pregnant. Also part of a strange part of the story of she was 9 months pregnant. Why would she have to schlep all the way from Nazareth to Bethlehem? It wasn't an easy trip back then. And the only person that really had to travel back was Joseph. Only he was from Bethlehem originally. So why does she have to schlep all the way down with him? And if it's his hometown, why can't they find a place to stay? They were told that that's where his family was, and we're told that there was no room anywhere to stay, and they have to stay in a barn somewhere, in a stable. The whole story is quite strange. But we're told she was expecting a child, and while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born, and she gave birth to a son, her firstborn. She wrapped him in swaddling clothes, laid him in a manger because there was no room for them to lodge in the house. We go over to verse 21. After he's born, 8 days later, the time came to circumcise him. And he was given the name Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived. So we're told that he's born in Bethlehem. He's circumcised 8 days later. And then what happens? Then we're told in verse 22, then after their purification had been completed in accordance with the law of Moses, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. What does it mean, the days of purification? So the book of Leviticus in the Bible, the book of Leviticus chapter 12. Leviticus chapter 12 tells us that after the birth of a male child, the mother is impure for 33 days. So again, Jesus is born. 8 days later, he's circumcised. 33 days later, they travel to Jerusalem to bring him up to the Lord, because it says in the Bible, every firstborn male shall be deemed to belong to the Lord. And also they went to Jerusalem to make the offerings as stated in the law, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, also from the book of Leviticus chapter 12. In verse 39, When they had done everything prescribed in the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. The child grew up big and strong, full of wisdom, and God's favor was upon him. So there are two very peculiar things that you have to note about this chapter in Luke. Problem number one is that it tells us that the city of Joseph and Mary was not Bethlehem. The city of Joseph and Mary was Nazareth. And what is Jesus called throughout his life? He's called Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Nazarene. He's never called Jesus the Bethlehemite. So there's strong evidence, possibly, that Jesus may not have been from Bethlehem. He might have been from Nazareth. And that's why he's always called Jesus of Nazareth. And Luke comes up with this insane story that they had to go temporarily to the Bethlehem, and she gives birth there at the last minute in a manger, and they stay there for 8 days and then 33 days, and then they go to Jerusalem to bring sacrifices, and then after all that, they go back to where? To Nazareth. The second problem here, if you were paying attention, we thought that it was dangerous. What happens in the book of Matthew? In Matthew, as soon as he's born, they're warned that it's too difficult to stay in Israel. They have to flee to Egypt. So in the book of Matthew, they flee to Egypt and they stay in Egypt until the death of Herod. But in Luke, we don't see anything about them having to go down to Egypt. In Luke, he's born in Bethlehem. He goes from Bethlehem, not to Egypt, he goes from Bethlehem to Jerusalem over a month later. He stays in Jerusalem for a while, and then they go back to Nazareth. There's no mention of having to go down to Egypt. So it doesn't seem as if these two stories really are describing the same life. There seems to be a lot of ambiguity about what was going on with the birth of Jesus. Was he really someone that was from Bethlehem? Was he born in Bethlehem? Or was he born in Nazareth? And Luke comes up with this whole story to drag him down to Bethlehem very, very artificially. But let's go down. In John chapter 1, verses 44 to 46, watch what happens. Now Philip was of Bethesda, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law, in the Torah, and the prophets did write. We found the person that the Bible speaks of, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can there be any good thing that comes out of Nazareth?" You are thinking that Jesus is special? Who cares about Jesus? He's from Nazareth. So it seems as if the feeling back then, the common knowledge was that Jesus was from Nazareth, not from Bethlehem. And this is never challenged, by the way. It's never challenged. In John chapter 7, verses 41 and 43, the same thing happens. Others said, "This is the Messiah, this is the Christ." But some said, "How could he be the Messiah? Shall the Messiah come out of the Galilee?" So we see in the Gospel of John that there seems to have been back then the common feeling, the common understanding that Jesus was from Nazareth, not from Bethlehem. Meaning if he was someone that was born in Bethlehem and from Bethlehem, people wouldn't have challenged his credentials by saying he's from the wrong city. So again, to summarize, the Christian assertion is that Micah chapter 5 tells us that the Messiah has to be born in Bethlehem. That's not true. All Micah is telling us is that the Messiah will descend from King David, who is from the city of Bethlehem. Secondly, the book of Micah never tells us that the Messiah will be a divine being who exists eternally. Quite the contrary, Micah makes it clear that the Messiah will not be God. And finally, just to read the Christian Bible on its own terms, it's not so clear that Jesus was someone that we could say definitively was from Bethlehem.